All right. Welcome, everyone, and congratulations on your recent awards. My name is Sari Schumann. I co-direct the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center. I'm joined today by Erin Long from the Administration for Community Living, Kate Gordon, and Stephanie Hughes, also of the Resource Center. We are going to get started in a minute with our presentation. All of the materials we review today and the OMB data collection forms and related data terms and frequently asked questions will be sent to you after the meeting. We'll also send a link to the NADRC website and your reporting calendar. We are going to start off hearing from Erin Long. Erin, I will get to the first slide for you. Tell me when you'd like me to continue, when you'd like me to advance.
Great, thanks. So hi, everybody. Congratulations on your awards. We're super excited for this wonderful group of new grantees for our Alzheimer's Disease Initiative program. It's exciting because we have grantees from a broad scope of geographically as well as activity-wise. You have already met Sari. You're going to meet Kate and Stephanie as we move through our time, and then Richard. We also have a great, they're just a sampling of the great technical assistance team that we have in place with the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center, the NADRC, which you'll learn about a lot over the coming the next few years, but really during the next several months. So during our time, I'm going to talk to you about what a cooperative agreement is, some grants management topics. We're going to talk about the planning phase, your project planning phase, and then the reporting requirements. And then we're going to have some time for you all to ask your questions as they come up. And then we're going to have a break, like Sari said, and Richard's going to, Richard Adrian from our grants office of grants management, ACL's office of grants management, is going to join us to give you some insights on financial management of your program. So next slide. So just so you understand how we set our programs up, we have your agency staff, which is your staff that's involved in the project, the funded project. That'll be your program director and and at times your finance people. Then you also have your ACL staff. Every grant, if you don't know who it is already, you will have a project officer assigned to you. It will either be myself, Dr. Vijeth Iyengar, or Sarah Markel from ACL. And then every team is fortunate to have someone from the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center have a technical assistance liaison assigned to them. And then that person also has a partner who backs them up so that you're never left alone without resources to answer your questions. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to go real quickly over your cooperative agreement. I don't know how many of you are, previous recipients of government grants. Cooperative agreements are a little bit different than a standard government grant. A cooperative agreement provides for the substantial involvement and collaboration of ACL in all activities that the recipient organization will carry out in accordance with the provisions of the approved grant award. And basically that means that we're your partners in this, and we have to agree on what's going to happen with your grant. You will learn through the planning phase how we envision or how that works from ACL side in accordance with the law that is in place for cooperative agreements. Next slide, please. So you all should have received your notice of award. On that notice of award, it basically identifies two key roles for grantees, and that is the authorized organizational representative. That is the person in the organization that has the authority to obligate them to accept the grant and obligate funds and receive funds. So they signed the application. They are assuming the obligation that you follow the law that that you're subject to as in terms of being a government grantee, and they're the ones that ensure the compliance, and they oversee the project director. The project director, some people call it the program director, the principal investigator. This isn't research, so people can sometimes, they can call it a principal investigator, but it's really a project director because it's not research. And that's the person who's responsible day to day for the program management and the reporting, the program reporting, which is the narratives, the data that we request or we require, and then the financial reporting. And that is really the person that your program officer, your ACL program officer, and your TA liaison will have the most contact with throughout the duration of the grant. So just next slide, please. On just a couple of tips or a couple of points on the notice of award. That is your official document that is establishing the relationship with ACL, and it includes guidelines. Please make sure to review the terms and conditions that are included in your notice of award. Those are the specific things that are non-negotiable in the receipt of the grant, and then it identifies the dollar amounts, both the federal and the non-federal funds that are tied to the grant. And just to note, those numbers never change. Once you get your award, there are opportunities over time perhaps to revise your budget, but your budget must always align with the numbers that are in your notice of award. Next slide, please. So more on the notice of award, just please make sure you review it, make sure that you're understand all of the terms and condition and that you are complying with them and establishing the necessary accounts. Richard is going to talk more about the financial steps with the grants management. The first drawdown of funds basically is your acknowledgement that you agree to all the terms and conditions that are included in your notice of award. So please make sure you know what those are before you draw down any funds, which this is a reimbursement style grant. So nobody's theoretically done anything yet. So I don't imagine anybody's drawn down any funds yet. It also has the reporting schedules for not only your narrative reports, but more importantly, your financial reports. Next slide, please. So as I said, drawing down a payment equals your acceptance of the terms, the award, and the terms and the conditions that we put forward with it. Here it says that, while I said it's a reimbursement style, it is possible if you needed to set up a system to do advance payment, we can work that out. And there's lots of information in your notice of award about the payment management system. So how you will be able to set your accounts up and access that system. Next slide, please. So there's some things that are not changeable in your notice of award, you can change things. For instance, the authorized organizational representative, we always call it the AOR. If you want to change things like your AOR or your program director, that does require approval of ACL. So both of those would require your making a formal submission. There's different processes for whether you're changing an AOR or a PD. So if you get into a situation where you need that, our technical assistant team or your project officer can provide you the instructions to do that. Next slide, please. So you're probably all already aware that we use a grants management system called Grant Solutions. All of our grantees are required to use this for their grants management. That's where all of your data reports, your narrative reports, your program deliverables, all of those are uploaded into Grant Solutions so that we have a full record of everything that's taken place on your grant. If the primary players on your team should have probably already have received notification that an account has been established for them. But here's, there are some grantees that request an administrative account. So someone that perhaps isn't the PD or the AOR can assist their internal team with uploading grant materials to that system. We can help you get that if that's what you want. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see the help desk that for Grant Solutions, and they are very adept at addressing concerns of grantees. They've been doing it for many, many years. So hopefully they can get you straight. So the one thing I wanted to point out that is on your notice of award is when you issue statements, press releases, you need to acknowledge that the program is sort of a disclaimer. It needs to acknowledge that you were funded with ACL funding, whether in part or fully. I know some of you have received grants from us before. I would just note for you that actually our disclaimer statement was recently changed, and we are obligated by law to include this new disclaimer. So for everybody on the call, if you are creating something and want to know about including the disclaimer, just talk it over with your project officer or your technical assistance liaison, and they can help you determine whether a disclaimer statement is necessary to include on some product. It's always just good to just have this disclaimer included in things, but we can help you determine where it's appropriate and where it's not. Now I'm going to turn you over to Kate Gordon, who is going to talk about the project planning phase.
Great. Thanks, Erin. And as Erin said, we're back to the beginning. So here we are. You're at the beginning of your project planning phase, which was outlined in the program announcement at the very beginning. If you want to go back to that to find out how long does this last? Well, on average, the project planning phases last between 3 and 6 months. We have had grantees go as far as 18 months with changes in their leadership, locations, COVID, et cetera. So if you're feeling like you're behind, you are not. This is just the beginning. So average 3 to 6 months, and it's really a step-based program. So we work with you as the TA liaisons, the project officers, and your staff, as well as partners, to develop a completely revised work plan. So what you produced and sent in your application will not be your final work plan. 3 to 6 months of looking at that original application, what reality is like for your grant now or your organization now, or maybe your partners changed. All of that will be negotiated and worked on for a final revised work plan. After your work plan is finished, then you go back to start over with your new evaluation plan. Whereas you may talk about some outcomes and outputs during your work plan itself, the evaluation plan is going to be a different process based on this new revised work plan. So again, what you submitted in your original application was great. It helped the reviewers to really understand where you wanted to go, but nearly all those details will change as your work plan changes as well. Totally normal. Everybody goes through it. During the planning phase itself, where we're working on your work plan and evaluation plan, you do have access to funds. So during this planning phase, you have access to up to 15% of your total grant funding. So to turn the lights on, hire new staff, pay yourselves for the work that you're doing during this planning period, 15% of the total grant funds is accessible to you. but you cannot move into the implementation phase until your work plan, your revised evaluation plan, and perhaps a revised budget have been submitted to your ACL project officer and approved. You will submit the revised work plan, the revised evaluation plan, and perhaps your revised budget narrative as a note in Grant Solutions. As Aaron said, that's the grant management system that we use, and we expect everybody will have access to that. You're going to put your work plan, evaluation plan, and your budget into Grant Solutions as a note. We actually have a meeting with you called an exit phase, planning phase exit conference. So once that's happened, you'll get verbal approval, then you'll upload your materials, then you get written approval. Then you move on to the implementation phase, which is what we're all about, serving people with dementia and their caregivers, helping to increase the dementia capability of our partners and professionals in the field. The implementation phase is where you're actually going to be working towards your program goals. You're going to be working towards the anticipated outcomes, working on data collection, et cetera. And you'll have access to more TA assistance in the form of conference calls and webinars. You're meeting right now with your TA staff and your project officer. Those meetings will continue, but probably not weekly, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly if you guys really are going gangbusters on getting your outcomes accomplished. Next slide, please. So we have resources available. Perhaps you've already had your initial meeting with your technical assistance staff as well as your project officer. But if you haven't, you should really start looking at the types of resources that are available in this planning phase. There are work plan and evaluation resources available on the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center website. This is an active link. After the webinar, you'll receive access to the slides and you can click on writing an effective work plan and evaluation plan. Or for you chronic overachievers, you might be Googling it right now. It's a website where there's access to a webinar that goes in depth into this work plan and evaluation plan process with a lot of suggestions and tips. There on that same website is a work plan template, an evaluation plan template, a sample work plan that has been approved by ACL, and a sample evaluation plan also approved by ACL. You'll also see a tip sheet for work and evaluation plans. I can't emphasize enough that this project planning phase is extremely detailed. We go line by line through your work plan and evaluation plan, whereas we don't use pens anymore. We use track changes through Word documents. So you'll hear from your technical assistance staff asking you to please always utilize Microsoft Word so that we can track changes in your document. And the same thing with your evaluation plan. We prefer that you use the templates, which are in Word form, so that we can track with you. So take a look at these materials that are available to you. I'm going to show you some previews. Next slide, please. This is a preview of some of the planning resources. Here's an example of a sample work plan. You'll see the format, which was provided in the notice of award for you to take a look at. Every grant will use the same format. We ask you to restate and sometimes redefine your objectives. What are the activities that you're going to do to accomplish those objectives, some of the key tasks that staff or partners are going to be responsible for during your project period, who the lead person is for each task, which are related to activities and objectives. And then you'll see that we have a 3-year timeline, and those X's markate where the active period working on a key task may be. The evaluation plan also templated objectives, activities, which will match the objectives and activities in your work plan. The outputs, outcomes, and outcome measures are keenly defined. Next slide, please. So let's go back to the work plan. As I said, on that website about work plans, you'll find the tips that are outlined here. These are just some of the highlights. First and foremost, this program requires that you serve and identify 3 gap areas: behavior symptom management, individuals living with developmental or intellectual developmental disabilities and dementia or at risk of dementia, and persons who live alone. All 3 of those gap areas must be clearly identifiable in your objectives or activities. So if you can't find, if you search your current work plan and you can't find behavior symptom management, if you can't find IDD, you can't find live alones, neither can we. That's where we're going to start when we start working on your work plan with you. Second, we want to make sure that we know the numbers. How many people do you plan to serve with these different activities within your objectives? We're going to ask very specifically for you to tell us how many people are going to be served and per year. So this is a 3-year plan. As you'll notice in the example above, it's 300 trained per year, 900 total. So we're asking for specific numbers of outputs. We also ask within your tasks to do things like define when you're going to develop contracts with your partners. Define specifically how the participants, persons with dementia, persons living alone, caregivers, how are they going to be identified? How are you going to market services to them? And perhaps when are you going to create an outreach plan? Lastly, and important to note in a work plan is that if you are planning to create trainings or other protocols, those have to be in your tasks as well. It's not just that we're going to provide a training. If you have to create the training before you provide the training, make sure that that task is clearly identified and how long it may take you to develop your protocols or training. Next slide, please. On the evaluation side, a few things to just highlight again. Your objectives and activities must identically mirror the objectives and activities in your work plan. We're asking you to really focus in your evaluation plan on direct services. So what are you doing within your project period to serve persons with dementia and their caregivers, or do things like train professionals and increase their dementia capability? So direct services are defined in the notice in the FOA, which you referred to. Make sure that when you're talking to your TA staff and program officers that you're able to identify this is a direct service and you agree upon that with your project officer. The project officer is the authority on whether an objective activity or task is a direct service. So in this document, the evaluation plan, you're going to show how those outcomes for your direct services are going to be measured, including listing the exact specific evaluation instruments that you're going to be using. So for example, if you're going to be using the Zaret burden scale, there are many versions of the Zaret burden scale. Be very specific which, for example, Zaret burden scale are you going to be using. So also of note, outcome measures are not required for some of the activities that you might be doing, such as developing an advisory group or distributing resources. Those might just be outputs. You know, we got 13 members of advisory groups from representing 6 different underserved communities. Those are outputs, not outcomes. Outputs versus outcomes will be something that you'll be addressing with your TA liaison and project officer. The evaluation plan will also outline how you're going to collect data, who's going to do the data analysis, and how those data are going to be reported and to whom. So that's also going to be directly stated in your evaluation plan. And the people responsible for those activities, just like you saw in your work plan, will be in that final column that we see in front of us. Next slide, please. So moving away from this planning period with your work plan and your evaluation plan, we also need to mention some concurrent activities that happen during your full grant period. As outlined in your notice of award, there are specific reporting requirements that ACL requires that you report formally through a note in Grant Solutions about the activities and services that you're providing through this grant. There are a number of reporting requirements that we're going over right now that our friend Richard is going to go over in financial reporting next. And Sari Schumann's going to talk us through the dementia capability assessment, which was also part of the response to the notice of the FOA, the opportunity. So from number 1, this semi-annual report is actually also called a semi-annual program progress report. It's also sometimes referred to as your semi-annual narrative report. These are every 6 months throughout the life of your grant. You have to report to ACL about the direct services that have been provided. My colleague Stephanie is going to talk to you about the Office of Management and Budget's required data reporting that we utilize. The narrative report that I just said first is also called the Program Progress Report. It is effective of your start date. So the day that you started, you report from the day that you started through the end of a 6-month period and report to ACL what you've been working on. even if all you've been doing is participating in the program planning period, you're going to write a narrative that describes the work that you've been doing during the program period. And everything is submitted through Grant Solutions. The one thing to note in your narrative report is that this is only a narrative about what you've been doing with the funds that are allocated through this grant. We don't need to know what your organization overall has been doing. So for example, if your gala is coming up soon, it has nothing to do with your federal project. So please keep that out of your narrative report, and good luck in your fundraising opportunities. The data report that Stephanie's going to walk us through in just a moment should also be submitted at the same time as your semi-annual narrative report. And that's going to also be through Grant Solutions. Everything on the data report is going to be submitted in Excel format. Everything on the narrative report is going to be submitted in a Word document. So we're using Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel to submit all of these as part of your semi-annual reports. Richard's going to go through our financial status reports that are required and those dates. So he'll follow up with us. And as I said, Sari's going to go through the dementia capability assessment. A calendar of the due dates for all of these are going to be provided to you after this call. So you'll know when a semi-annual report is due, when a financial report is due, when the dementia capability assessments are due. But if you have specific questions about how do I fill out a semi-annual report, what does it look like, those questions can be answered from your project officer or your National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center liaison. I'm going to hand over the reins to Stephanie, who's going to talk to you a little bit more about the components of your semi-annual report.
Thanks, Kate. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Hughes. I'm also a member of the Resource Center. And like Kate said, I will share with you a little bit more detail about the semi-annual reports that you are required to submit. As Kate mentioned, these reports contain both a narrative and a spreadsheet showing the numbers of the direct services that you've been providing. The narrative report that you send to us is focused on the activities that occurred during the most recent 6-month reporting period. And on the previous slide, there was a link to the template that you'll use for submitting that narrative report. So it's all laid out for you in terms of kind of the order of how to report things and what information to include. Your report will also include a data spreadsheet showing cumulative numbers of people who you have served or trained since the start of your grant. And so I just want to highlight this piece because the numbers are cumulative. You know, each time you submit your report, the numbers should be increasing or at a minimum staying the same. We shouldn't see the numbers go down over time because each time you submit the report, you're adding to the numbers from the previous report. These numbers do get submitted on a standard OMB approved spreadsheet. So please use the form that we have provided to you. Please don't modify the spreadsheet by adding rows or adding formulas or anything like that. And please do fill out all fields on the spreadsheet when you send in your data. Even if you're filling in a 0 because you haven't served anyone yet, that's totally fine. But please do indicate a 0 where appropriate. Next slide. And if you want to just advance through all of these at once, you can. Thanks, Sari. So now we'll just take a brief look at the types of data that all grants are required to collect and report on this spreadsheet. So the first category in this upper left-hand corner is information about the number of people with dementia and caregivers who you have served. And you're going to be asked to collect not just the number of people you've served, but also demographic data on those people. So there are categories on this form like race, ethnicity, gender, age, whether the person with dementia lives with a caregiver or alone. There are several categories that are along those lines. The second category that you see in the upper right-hand corner is a count of professionals who you have trained. And we're asking for the people that you've served and the people that you've trained that you report unduplicated numbers. So if you have a professional who attends more than one training, they're only counted once on this particular worksheet. There is a different spot I'll get to in a moment where you can kind of record that volume of training that you're providing. But in terms of reporting the people with dementia, the caregivers, or the professionals, Each person who receives any type of services is just reported one time. The next category is direct service units, and that is where you're indicating kind of that measure of the amount of time that you're devoting to each client or person that you're training. So if you're training one person for 5 hours, this is where you'll be indicating that volume of service that you've delivered. And finally, the last category here is expenditures. That's where you're going to report on the percentage of the grant funds that you have spent on different categories, including direct services, other programmatic costs like planning, and administrative costs, such as the time that you spent on reports and contract development. And I just want to highlight briefly that there is a definitions and FAQs document that goes into a lot of detail explaining these categories, giving examples of specific situations or questions that might come up. I really encourage you to use that as a resource in addition to contacting your TA lead with questions. But that's a great resource for you to help explain some of the details of these categories and how to calculate your expenditures and that sort of thing. So these are the 4 categories of data that you'll be reporting on this form. Next slide, please. So finally, I just wanted to show you a snapshot of what the first page of the OMB data collection form looks like. There's a lot of information in today's orientation, so we're not going to go right now into all the details of how to complete the form. But I do want to let you know that there's a training video available that covers this form in detail with instructions, and it's linked on this slide. We recommend that you and your evaluator review this training video and also discuss these data requirements during your planning process, just to make sure that you're setting up forms and data collection processes that are appropriate and that are going to meet all of your requirements. And now I'm going to turn things back to Kate.
Thanks, Stephanie. Sarah, you can go ahead and advance all of those. Thank you very much. So I'm just stepping back. When Stephanie showed you her previous set of slides, when she talked about the expenditures, I'm going to go over in depth a little bit more about about those OMB expenditures. Let's start off with kind of a basic. Again, you have agreed that in your grant, you are going to spend not less than 50% of your total funds on direct services. So when we say grant funds, this means the entirety, all of the money that is in your notice of award. So when it says total funds, the total funds is what we're talking about, 50% of your total funds. So if you applied for $1 million, but you had $250,000 in match, 50% of the million plus 250,000 plus is what we're talking about. It is not the federal funds. It's federal plus what you're bringing to the table. 50% of the total is what we need to see spent on direct services. So the tracking of these expenditures over time is what we use the OMB documents 3rd page of the spreadsheet for. The direct services don't, obviously, it's only 50% of your total funds. There are other categories or buckets of spending or expenditures that we also ask for you to track every 6 months or show every 6 months. So direct service, it's time or funds spent on your gap areas such as behavioral symptom management. It could be the direct service that you're providing in doing professional training or provision of an evidence-based or evidence-informed intervention to persons with dementia or their caregivers, or if in the case of your grant, you might be providing respite. Those are all examples of direct service. Again, in your work plan, you'll keenly define those with your project officer. Another bucket of expenses are administrative expenses. So these are direct and sometimes indirect costs related to routine grant administration and monitoring. So if it's the receipt and disbursement of program funds, if you're paying out your partners, the preparation of routine grant reports, so those semi-annual reports or your financial reports, contract development with your partners and monitoring of those contracts. Those are administrative activities. Then there's kind of this 3rd bucket of other program expenses. And those are things that are costs that are associated with really substantive programmatic work. So such the time that you're spending in your work and evaluation plan development. If you plan to provide professional training, but you have to develop a curriculum for that training, the time spent in developing a curriculum for professional training, or if you're creating a new intervention for family caregivers, curriculum development is other program expense. It is not a direct service. Outreach and marketing, also considered other program expenses, and any of the time spent on your evaluation activities by yourself or your third-party evaluator, those are also program expenses. You can ask for more detail again of these buckets from your technical assistance staff members. But remember, when you're reporting all of your expenditures, it's the total grant funds. So total grant funds, a total approved budget, the federal and the non-federal share together. And in the OMB document, since it's delivered every 6 months, as Stephanie said, this is a cumulative report. So the number should never go down, percentages should never go down. Next slide, please, Sari. And I also wanted to touch on, sometimes people get confused about the nomenclature, the words that we use, our vocabulary in these projects. One of the sets of terms that gets confused are direct services versus matching funds. So as I said, grantees, you have to spend 50% of your total grant funds on direct services. That's the provision of direct services to persons with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia and or their caregivers. The grant funds, again, total approved budget. This is different from your match, or which was a requirement of 25% of a match to whatever you requested from the federal government. And Richard has outlined that in your notice of award, so you know exactly what those funds are. Those funds the match could be done in cash or in kind. One thing that I will say about match and direct services is that some grantees use matching funds to support administrative and other program expenses, such as office space and printing, but matching funds can also be used when calculating direct services. So sometimes your cash or in kind, for example, in kind time from volunteers, maybe you in the service of persons with dementia or their caregiver, may be calculated towards your direct service as well. So make sure that you have a conversation with your TA and your project officer with regards to how you're using your match. But all direct services, whether that be through match funds, cash or in kind, or through federal funds, must be outlined completely in your work plan. Thank you, Sari.
Great, thank you, Kate and Stephanie and Erin. So as you all know, it's critical that grantees build dementia capability into their programs and projects in partnership with the key agencies in their communities. At the onset of your projects and annually thereafter, and at the end of your project, you will be required to conduct an assessment of the dementia capability of your existing system, as will your partners who are delivering direct services to people living with dementia or their caregivers, or who have staff receiving dementia training. The dementia capability assessment tool includes questions related to a number of areas, like identification of people living with dementia and their caregivers, staff training on dementia topics, specialized services for people living with dementia, etc. And assessing the dementia capability of your organization and your system will allow you to create some metrics for use in future service program evaluations and a basis for setting your goals, objectives, and milestones for your program through this grant period. So we will work with you to determine the appropriate respondents for the dementia capability assessment, and the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center staff will send those assessments out to you through an online link. I'm going to preview what that looks like for you. So this is what the initial page of the dementia capability assessment will look like when you get your online link and enter the system. The assessment really only takes about 10 to 15 minutes and should be completed by someone who understands the entirety of your organization and the work you will be doing on your grant project. Sometimes organizations will work, side by side with a partner from the organization, maybe the CEO and the project director for the grant program, so that they can answer the questions together and ensure accuracy in their responses. Please note that your evaluator and others who work on your project in more administrative roles do not need to complete the assessment. This is purely for those providing direct services and supports to people living with dementia and their caregivers, and those who employ staff who are receiving dementia training. So this is just how you'll answer the questions in an online format. You will indicate where your grant is located, the name of the organization, and whether you are the grantee or the partner organization that is completing the assessment. Some other items that you'll learn about throughout your time with your ADPI project is that the National Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center runs a webinar series. Grantees participate in this webinar series, and they also can watch the archived versions of the webinars through the NADRC website. When you get the materials for this webinar after we complete our session today, you'll be able to link up to the webinars and training sessions directly through the link you see on this slide. And you also can take a look at the NADRC website in its entirety, which can provide you with all different sorts of information. We have reports, toolkits, guides on this website that have been developed by the Resource Center, also some developed by grantees who have completed their work, or some who are still in process, some of their tools and instruments that they use that can be very helpful to all of you as you complete your work. We also have a section on the website that includes the reporting tools for grantees. So in addition to receiving the OMB materials that we referenced during the session today via email, you also will be able to reference and get those off of the NADRC website. So please use this as a tool and ask your technical assistance staff person from the Resource Center if you have questions about it, or your program officer from ACL. So you should know your NADRC technical assistance staff person by this point, and your project officer. If you have questions or you haven't found the email from those people at this time, you can always contact Erin or myself and we can get you connected. Our contact information is here on this slide. We're happy to help you throughout the lifetime of your grant projects. At this time, we will open it up for questions. I'm going to stop sharing so I can see if you raise your hands, and I'm going to allow you to unmute yourselves. So if you have a question and you'd like to either enter it into the chat, or you would like to raise your hand or unmute yourself to ask, that would be just fine. Questions from anyone? And while we wait, Erin and Stephanie and Kate, if there's anything that you meant to say that you missed, you can also unmute yourselves and add that information in now. But we must have done a really good job because no one has questions.
The only thing that I would add that we didn't cover that we probably should cover is as you are planning your projects and as you're planning your reporting, that please consider that if you're going to be having some private pay or billing your resources, you're billing Medicare or Medicaid for your service and receiving income on your projects, that too is something that you need to report on your annual financial reports and in your narrative reports. And if you get to a place that you are actually developing income, related to your program, we'll need to have discussions with you on how to report that back to ACL and how you roll those resources back into your grants.
Great, thank you. A question came in through the chat asking how difficult is it to change roles for grant management, such as the project director,
It's not difficult. So if you were going to change your project director at this early stage, you would submit to us that person's resume, and you would need for us to approve that person for that role. So it would have to be someone that has the appropriate skill set to do whatever it is that is proposed. And that would come through Grant Solutions. I mean, you could do it with your program officer and your TA liaison, but ultimately you would submit the request to Grant Solutions.
Great, thank you. A question just came in about walking through Grant Solutions and the payment management system. And in about 13 minutes, we'll start that part of the session on the hour. So we will talk a little bit about all the different financial pieces of the project, and Richard Adrian will be going through all of that. Other questions that anyone has that they want to enter through the chat or ask on Zoom?
If there's no questions, we can just take a break until.
That's what's going to be my suggestion. I am going to propose a break. Everyone can come back for the financial management session in about, let's say in about 10 minutes. So everyone's back 2 minutes before we start. I will pause our recording. So if there's noise in the background, we won't have that on the recording. All set, Richard.
Great, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have a chance to speak with all of you. I had to admit, like doing a presentation virtual without seeing faces, without seeing reactions, very difficult. So I'm going to try my best. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Richard Adrian, and I am your grants management specialist. First, I want to thank you for carving some time to attend today's discussion. We have a chat feature, and I encourage you to ask any questions. I've already had a chance to communicate with many of you via email, but it's nice to see so many familiar faces as well as names on the calls, as well as new ones. Again, I want to congratulate you all for being awarded an ACL grant. You've just heard from Aaron Long, your ACL program officer, along with the rest of the technical assistance team. And now I'm sure you're eager to hear from me to give you some tips and just to have a discussion on successfully managing your grant. And during this unprecedented and challenging time with COVID-19, the TA team, your program officer, your whole team at ACL, we're here to help your project succeed. And we're here to provide any resources and TA that we can. So what am I going to be talking about today? The purpose of the presentation is to provide tips on effectively managing your grant. We will also discuss the grant management system, which specifically the payment management system, which I will be referring to as PMS, and grant solutions. We will then conclude with a Q&A session at the end. Before we jump into the presentation, I'd like to hear from some of you please use the chat feature to highlight what are some helpful grant management tips that you've learned. So feel free to chime in using the chat feature and let me know what are some of helpful grant management tips that you've learned. While I wait for some of the chat to come in, some of the responses I've heard, I've actually had asked a couple of questions prior to this presentation to help me tailor this presentation. And some of the things I've heard, which were all great, include understanding your grant requirements. So we talked about making sure that you thoroughly review your notice of funding opportunity that you applied for this grant. So when applying for this grant, you apply to a notice of funding opportunity, and that notice of funding opportunity contains a wealth of information, as well as the terms and conditions of your notice of award. So make sure that you're really familiar with that. Other tips I've heard was having a strong organizational structure that produces and is accountable for delivering results, having a great internal control, strong internal controls in your organization is very important. Maintaining thorough and accurate documentation, and ensuring timely and accurate submission of all reporting, whether that's financial reporting or your program progress reports, as well as regularly communicating with your grant officer. And I've seen some chat coming in, and I apologize, I don't think I can quite see the chat. Let me pull this right here. Okay. Some things I see are, let's see here. Yep. Ensuring outcomes are measurable. There's clear method for data tracking, all good. Effective and frequent communication with program partners, yes. Those are all good tips. So again, I will repeat this several times, but one of the first tips that I would like to share is to thoroughly review and read your notice of award. Specifically, look at the terms and conditions of your notice of award. Look at your approved budget and your reporting due dates. I do understand that you're going to have a planning period to discuss your budget, your program work plan, as well as your budget with your program officer. But whatever is approved, those are the documents that you should be using, and making sure that everyone that works on the grant are familiar with those documents. Your notice of award also lists your required match, so your non-federal share, that's listed as well. And one of the questions actually I had asked, what are some questions that you may have for me for this presentation? I received a question about the salary limitation. And again, that's actually spelled out on your notice of award, that you cannot pay personnel anything in excess of the executive level 2 salary, and that amount, and that's specified. That's an example of what's specified in your notice of award. And the next step is to use your approved budget as a guide and roadmap to spending your grant fund. Again, with that planning phase, when you have a chance to hash out your budget, your approved program plan, once everything's approved, those are the documents that you want to use as a guide, again, a map on how you should spend down your grant funds. And it was mentioned prior, but I'm going to repeat it, that you indicate acceptance of the terms and the conditions of your award when you're actually requesting to draw down from the payment management system, PMS. So I wanted to highlight some important policy documents that everyone should be familiar with, as well as have bookmarked on their computer. I would highly recommend it. The first one, the Department of Health and Human Services Grants Policy Statement, provides policy guidance on managing HHS awards. So this would be a great resource to help manage not only your ACL grant, but any other HHS grants that you may have. So the purpose of the GPS, which stands for Grants Policy Statement, is to make available in a single document the general terms and conditions of HHS discretionary grant and cooperative agreement awards. These general terms and conditions are common across all HHS operating divisions, and they apply as indicated in the HHS GPS unless there are statutory, regulatory, or award-specific requirements to the contrary as specified in your notice of award. So what does that mean? It means that there's an order of precedence that statutory, regulatory, or award-specific requirements, they supersede the grant's policy statements. And if you have any questions on a specific item on that, feel free to reach out to me via email, and I will provide my email address at the end of this presentation. Additionally, also make sure that you bookmark the uniform administrative requirements, cost principles, and audit requirements for federal awards, which is known as 45 CFR 75. And it's divided into different subparts. And one of the subparts that I want to highlight is subpart E, which establishes the principles for determining the allowable costs incurred by grantees under the federal awards. If you've had other federal grant awards, which many of you have, I'm sure you're probably familiar with 2 CFR 200. So basically 45 CFR 75 is HHS adapted and codified to CFR 200 and made a specific version for HHS. HHS grantees use 45 CFR 75. If you have a strong and thorough knowledge of 2 CFR 200, the good news is that there's a lot of overlap. A lot of the same cost principles. A lot of it is interchangeable. There's a lot of similarities, but if you're ever wanting to dig in and do some research about your specific ACL grant, you should make sure to research 45 CFR 75. A quick Google search of 45 CFR 75, it will pop it up. Next, I want to highlight the ACL Managing Your Grant site, which contains many useful information to help you administer your grant award. Can you see the next slide?
Yes, we can.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So this is a screenshot of ACL's Managing Your Grant site, which has different sections to help you administer your grant award. So if you go on acl.gov, you would find there's a section on managing your grant site, and I can provide the link on the chat as well. So I want to specifically point out the section on information for new grantees. Again, make sure to familiarize yourself with that. And someone had asked about amendments. If you see on the screenshot, there's a section that says requesting a grant amendment, and it provides instructions on the different amendments, what documents you need, and basically what the different amendments entail, as well as Grant Solutions also provides these directions, and I'll be happy to provide that. I'm going to touch up on that actually later on in this presentation. So again, I do want to hear from you. If you can please use the chat feature to answer the question of how does your organization determine whether you can charge something to your federal award. Two parts to that question also is, do you have any written guidance or policies to determine whether a cost is allowable? So I'll give a few seconds. If you want to answer, how does your organization determine whether you can charge something to your federal award? How do you know whether something is allowable? Don't all jump in at once. Again, it's the thing where I can't read the room. So if you're still typing, go ahead and put it there, and I'll make sure to look at it, but I will go on. Actually, I do see some responses here. Let's see. Having a clear definition for what is allowable within each budget category helps grantee determine if a cost is allowable, and follow federal guidelines as to allowability and uniform guidance cost principles. And those are all great points. And you've asked there that to the first point about clear definition of what is allowable within each budget category. I do want to point out to the resources, the 45 CFR 75, as well as the grants policy statement. They actually include a definition of each object class category, each line item in your budget, and they do have discussions on those as well, on what's allowable. There are some instances where it might be nuanced, and I would add to, first consult with those resources. But if you do see something on the uniform guidance cost principles, but you're still not sure, you can't find the answer 100%, it's not clear, that's when you would consult with your grants management specialists and your program officer as well, and we can help you with that. So you should have written policies and procedures to address the allowability of costs per the requirements of the ADPI program. So what some of those things includes putting in place adequate separation of duties and review and authorization of costs. And you should have also policies and procedures on if you saw that there was an unallowable cost, for example, how does your organization rectify it? For example, some organizations have a policy in place where they have to write a memo on what they found was unallowable, and how they rectified that situation, as well as when you're reviewing receipts or purchase orders. who's signing it? Do you have different people taking a look at it? Do you have different people reviewing it? You know, you don't have the same person. You have segregation of duties when it comes to the financial aspect. Those are important to make sure that your organization puts in place. And I'm not going to go do a deep dive in it. It's called internal controls, and the federal regulation actually talks a great length about that. And the tests that we use to determine whether you can charge something to your award is that all costs to charge to a federal award must be allowable, reasonable, allocable, and properly documented. Again, those are sort of like the standard that we look at to determine whether you can charge something to a federal award. Okay. So to be allowable under a federal award, the cost must be reasonable, allocable, and adequately documented. A cost is allowable if it serves the purpose of the award and is permissible based on federal regulations and your own accounting practices. A cost is reasonable if it does not exceed what a prudent person would incur under similar circumstances. For example, would a prudent person pay this amount for this item or service? Has there been a cost analysis done to ensure that grant funds are being used judiciously? Did you follow your own established practices and policies regarding the incurrence of cost? So a quick example is, you know, if you want to purchase a certain supply, but let's say you're purchasing a tablet that the normal, and by normal, I mean within your own market area, the cost for a tablet, for example, is $250, standard tablet, but on your proposed budget, the cost for the tablet is $600. Well, you know, we would sort of look at it and question, you know, what sort of analysis has been done to ensure that you've used federal funds in a prudent manner. And it kind of applies to your travel per diem as well. So when you request to travel, GSA has per diem rates for each city based on, you know, how the price of your per diem in hotels differ by city, but GSA has a rate. But if we see, you know, you're proposing to travel somewhere and the cost of the hotel is much more than what is approved by GSA, again, that's something that would not be reasonable. And those are just two examples here. A cost is allocable to a federal award to the extent that goods or services benefit the program. So can you allocate this particular cost to meet the needs of the ADPI program? Does it benefit what you're trying to achieve with this award? And a cost is adequately documented if it is supported by accounting records and source documentation, such as purchase orders, vouchers, invoices, payroll summaries, personnel activity reports, etc., or timesheets. Those documents, like the vouchers, invoices, personnel activity reports, or timesheets, you don't have to submit that to us unless we request it, but you don't have to submit it to us, but you should always keep your receipts. And the importance of that is in case there's ever any deeper monitoring or there's an audit, you want to make sure that for all federal costs that you have some sort of documentation to back it up. So you should always make sure that you keep your receipt. And the flow of ACL grant funds through your organization, it needs to be clear and well documented. You have to ensure that you can identify and provide accurate, current, and complete disclosure of each federal award you receive. So that goes with commingling of funds, and especially with organizations that have different federal funding streams. You want to make sure that you segregate your ADPI award so that it's clear that the ADPI award was used to pay this, and that it's not mixed with any other accounts that are, let's say, from another federal award or from another source of funding. And for more on this, the grants policy statement and the uniform guidance provides a deep dive of in definition of cost allowability, especially section E of 45 CFR 75. So again, I reference 45 CFR 75, and this is just an example that I want to point out. They have a section called consideration of selected items of cost. So basically, they go over certain items and determining whether or not certain things are allowable. And I want to caution that it's not always black and white, that context matters sometimes, right? So it's not just taking it in isolation and say, oh, well, for example, alcoholic beverages are always not allowable. They're unallowable, definitely for the ADPI grant awards, but there could be certain instances for another research award, for example, where it may be. But to be clear, under the ADPI award, alcoholic beverages are not allowable. But I just want to point out that although it goes over certain items of cost, it's not always black and white. In cases of discrepancy, you should consult with your grants management specialist if you have any questions on that. But it just gives you an idea of certain costs, and it's a pretty long list of certain costs, and it goes over whether something is allowable or not allowable. So I would recommend that you pay attention to this particular section. So we've just talked about cost allowability, and now I'm gonna jump into how you can access your grant funds. If you've had a prior ACL or other HHS grant award, you should be familiar with PMS. And PMS is a secure online payment platform which provides awarding agencies such as ACL and grant recipients, yourselves, with grant payment, cash management, and grant accounting support services. So once we make an award, and by making an award, I mean you receive your notice of award, we post the funds in the payment management system. So once you receive your notice of award, it automatically translates the money into the payment management system. But I do want to caution that you should actually only draw down funds from PMS to meet immediate cash needs, meaning you cannot draw down funds from PMS and have it sitting on your bank account. It should be to meet a specific and immediate cash need. And as a new grantee, you want to make sure that the person or someone from your organization or multiple people, depending on how you orchestrate and organize it, can successfully access PMS. You would need, again, to access PMS because it's important. That's where you're going to be completing your reports, your fiscal reports, as well as drawing down funds. So you want to make sure that someone has access to PMS. In addition to drawing down funds, you would complete your financial reports in PMS, and By financial reports, there are actually 2 financial reports that you must complete, and it's important that you're compliant with those reports, because delinquent reports may have an impact your ability to draw down funds. So you might ask, what are those 2 reports? First, you have your quarterly federal cash transaction report, and you also have an annual federal financial report. You have, I have a due date for the federal cash transaction report that I will get to in a second. And I also want to point out that as a grants management specialist, I do also monitor PMS to ensure that the amount that you draw down or your reported PMS disbursements align with where you should be in your project cycle. For example, let's say you all are just received your award now, but hypothetically, let's say we're in September 2022 or June 2022. And if you've barely drawn down any funds or reported any disbursements, that would be a red flag to me, because you've had this project for 2-3 years, but you haven't really drawn down any funds. So that's to say that where you are within your project, it should sort of align with how much funds or reported disbursements that you have in PMS. That's why it's important that you reconcile your use of grant funds frequently, whether that's quarterly or monthly, depending on your own internal cycles, because that will help you identify any issues that happen closer to when they occur, which makes them easier to address. And I'm gonna leave this slide up for a second. And basically, that's if you have questions or you want to set up your PMS account, make sure to contact that number or that email. And those slides will be sent to you all as well. So if you don't have a chance to write it down, you will have access to the slides. Right. So I also want to highlight great resources that PMS has on their website. I would encourage every recipient to attend a training on completing your federal financial report. They have trainings on how to navigate and search for your federal financial report and how to prepare and certify the report. The federal financial report is not due for a while, so you have some time, but you want to, those are live links that you will get, and it will take you to the PMS training. So you do want to sign up. I would encourage you to sign up to learn how to access the FFR module. And that's another thing. Just because you have access to PMS, you also want to make sure that you have access to the PMS FFR. By FFR, I mean Federal Financial Report module, because you would not only need access to PMS, but the PMS Federal Financial Report module. So when it comes time that you can successfully complete your federal financial report, and the federal financial report is annual. The PMS site, the second is a live link to your PMS liaison accountant, which is your PMS representative. If you have specific questions on that, you have a dedicated PMS liaison accountant that's there that you can find. Again, there will be a live link where you can find it, or you can just even Google PMS liaison accountant, and it will come right up. But I do want to point out, if you have general questions about, for example, navigating PMS or password assistance for PMS, you should actually contact the general PMS help desk and not the liaison. Those are for general administrative questions. And the third link provides PMS guidance on requesting drawdowns. I had mentioned earlier about the importance of written policies and procedures to minimize the time that elapses between the transfer of funds from PMS and the disbursement of those funds. So you should have written policies and procedures that everyone references and follows on drawing down from PMS. So it should be limited to the minimum amount needed to cover allowable project cost, and it must be timed in accordance with your actual immediate cash requirements of carrying out the approved project. And you shouldn't draw down funds for future expenditures. And here I have the due dates for the federal cash transaction report. I do want to point out and highlight that you actually have your first one due in 2 days, actually, October 30th. So the last bullet point here says your federal cash transaction report must be completed October 30th. I can anticipate questions. What if we have nothing to report? Then you would simply report your reported you would simply mark your reported disbursements as 0. But you should still complete it. I mean, I'm going to touch on the federal cash transaction report shortly, but it is due October 30th. And if you don't have any disbursements yet, or haven't or your disbursements are very minimal, then this should actually be a very easy and straightforward report to complete. I had mentioned the federal financial report training that PMS does, but I also want to highlight that PMS has a federal financial report user guide that provides information on how to access, complete, and submit the report in the federal financial report module in PMS. You would actually need to log in to PMS. So once you log into PMS, you will see this menu option under disbursement. Then you can simply click on FFR Grantee User Guide. You can download it and use it, and it will be helpful in helping you complete that when the time comes. So let me, what you see here, a financial report overview. And I'm not going to do a deep dive of this. PMS does that, as well as there's a lot of resources out there, but I do want to be cognizant of the federal cash transaction report that's coming up. And those are the main financial sections that you're reporting are actually those 3 sections. 10A, cash receipts, 10B, disbursements, and 10C, cash on hand. So cash receipt, this amount is actually going to be auto-populated for you, and that's based on your PMS drawdown. And your 10B disbursements, that's actually what you're going to be reporting. That's the sum of your actual cash disbursements for direct charges for goods and services. And you can read the definition on the slide. So that's what you're actually reporting, would be 10B disbursements. And the next is cash on hand, and that's an auto calculation. And so basically that's line 10A minus line 10B. And I mentioned that you should only draw down funds to meet immediate cash needs. So there's, if the cash on hand is a positive value, then you need to provide an explanation. So basically it indicates that you've drawn down fund, but you haven't dispersed it. But according to HHS policy, you should only draw down funds to meet immediate needs. So if that figure is positive, you would need to provide an explanation of why you basically have cash on hand, cash that's sitting. I'm gonna, for the interest of time as well, and because this is not gonna be due until a year for your annual federal financial report, what you see here, those are other data points for your federal financial report. And that's 10D is your, basically that's your award amount, and that will be auto-populated for you. That's the federal amount that you were awarded. You would see that on your notice of award as well. And 10E is the share of expenditures, and it's the charges made to the federally sponsored project or program. And depending on whether you report on a cash or accrual basis, that's depending on your own accounting method. Okay, so here's just, I really added this in since I will be sharing the slides so you have it for future reference, but I'm not going to go into it because this is not due until about a year. So you have some time, but I just wanted to make sure that I include this in so you have it as a frame of reference. And it's basically your federal share of expenditures, explaining what that is, whether you report on an accrual or a cash basis. And same thing with here, I provided definitions with unobligated versus unliquidated funds. And those are, I basically used some questions that I get and making sure that those are clear for you all to have as a point of reference. And basically your unobligated funds, it's the portion of the federal funds that you have not used, versus your unliquidated. This is the expenses that you've incurred, but you have not yet paid or charged to the grant. So those are two different things. Unobligated is basically how much of my federal awards have I not used, versus unliquidated is how much of my federal awards that you've incurred those expenses, but you just haven't yet paid it or charged it to the grant. And again, this is more for a reference, provide another deep dive on unliquidated obligation. So next, I will discuss, let's see here. Actually, I went too fast. Cost sharing or matching. I want to highlight a specific section of the Code of Federal Regulation, that's 45 CFR 75306, and that talks about at great length the requirements for cost sharing or matching. It's your non-federal share, your in-kind, and you will note what your amount for your non-federal share that's actually on your notice of award. You would see, under your budget, you have the federal share and you have your non-federal share. One important point is that the cost principles, the cost allowability for federal and non-federal funds are the same. So if something is not allowable, if it was federal funds, then they would not be allowable if it was non-federal funds. So they're treated the same, whether it's in terms of cost allowability, whether it's federal funds or non-federal funds, it's treated the same. I want to point out that you should maintain policies and procedures to address your match. It should be, again, keep your receipt. It should be verifiable from your records. It's not included as a contribution for any other federally assisted project or program. So you cannot use another source of federal funds as matched to this ADPI award. So you can't match federal funds with another source of federal funds. It's necessary and reasonable for the proper and efficient accomplishment of your project or program objectives. And I talked about D, and it's allowable and provided for in the approved budget. Again, that's an important point, that your match has to be allowable and it has to be documented as well on your approved budget. So next, let me transition to grant solutions. We've covered PMS, and I'll do I don't have much time, but want to touch at least on grant solutions. I'm sure most of you already have access to grant solutions. It's basically the management software that ACL uses to manage grants through the entire award lifecycle. Once you receive your award, the project director and authorized organizational representative, they're automatically provided access to grant solutions. I always give a tip that it's a good idea to add an additional staff in case there's ever any transition. So you can have another support staff person, basically someone who like uploads documents, or someone who they're not named on a notice, they're not listed on a notice of award, but they just have another like administrative access to grant solutions. As you know, there can be transitions within organizations, so it's always good to have another person in case the project director, authorized organizational representative transition, or someone's on vacation, for example. You want to make sure there's someone else, a third person, who has access to be able to upload certain documents, for example. It's not required, but it's a good tip that I would like to give to people. And if you do need to add another staff person, you would actually contact the Grant Solutions help desk, and I can provide their contact as well. Once we, I think I have it on the slide, so you would have that. So what do you use Grant Solutions for? You would use it to view your notice of award, view your award history, submit grant notes, and submit amendments. You might ask yourself, what is an amendment? So certain actions require prior approval from me and Aaron, so your program officer and GMS, before you can actually partake of those actions. So you would need to submit a grant solutions amendment when you want to modify certain key actions of your award. If you're uncertain whether a proposed action you want to take requires prior approval, it's always better to ask beforehand. And I've pointed at the ACL Managing Your Grant website. I pointed that out, that provides information on directions on amendments, but also one of the nice features of Grant Solutions that it has embedded instructions on what are the required documents to submit an amendment. So what documents, and it also provides an overview and definition of what's a budget revision. It provides instructions not only of the documents you need, but what that amendment actually is. Prior approval requests must be submitted as an amendment and not as a grant note. And the reason I highlight the first one is because sometimes in the past we've had grantees that they want to submit an amendment, but they do it as a grant note. But if it's a grant note, it doesn't trigger ACL, your program officer and grants management specialist, to review it as an amendment. An amendment is a specific action that you take on Grant Solutions for those prior approval. And again, that website provides directions on how you can submit an amendment on Grant Solutions. And if once ACL reviews and approves your amendment, you will receive a new notice of award that highlights those changes. If for some reason we don't approve it, we will make sure to communicate with you the reason why we didn't approve it. Oftentimes it's lack of documentation, or we need you to revise a certain document. We will work with you to make sure that that prior approval that you can meet it if it's in alignment with the project. And it's always a good idea to, when you submit an amendment as well, to alert us, just to let us know, that you plan to submit an amendment. If you want to talk about it beforehand, or if you have any questions, you're not quite sure if that constitutes if for a need for an amendment, it's better to ask beforehand and have a conversation. So some of the common amendments that we receive is a change of project director listed on a notice of award, or a budget revision. And basically you have leeway and you're gonna meet to talk about your approved plan and budget, but you do have leeway to move certain items within your direct cost categories, as long as it doesn't exceed 25% of your total cost award without prior approval. And if you're not adding or eliminating a new line item, if you are adding or eliminating a new line item, that would actually need a budget revision as well as if you didn't have any equipment, but you propose new equipment. And equipment, there's a definition in the CFR. It has a value of 5,000 or more. That would need a budget revision. I'm just kind of breezing through those, but there are directions on it as well, on those specific amendments. So what are some tips for success that I would like to give you all is to touch base with Aaron and myself, to ask questions and discuss changes to your grants. I know you have a formal process with the ADPI award, but throughout the life cycle of the grant award, keep in contact with us either through meetings, emails, phone calls, whatever your preferred method of communication is. Discuss any potential changes or concerns that could impact the grant, such as staffing concern, or if you have consultants concerns. Make sure it's better to let us know before something sort of evolves and when it's happening, then wait down the line when it's sort of when we could have addressed it much earlier on. And also keep in contact with your agency fiscal staff to monitor grant spending on a regular schedule, whether that's monthly or quarterly or however you do it. It's important for the program staff on your side to meet with the fiscal person as well, so that you all know what each one is doing and where you all are at, just to have constant communication between both of you, to know what the status of the grant spending is, and also to make sure that you're completing and submitting your reports in a timely manner. I've touched on this, but I'm highlighting it again because it's critical. You want to make sure you have documentation. You want to have written procedures and maintain policies and procedures for your accounting and financial management system, and track your actual use of ACL funds and reconcile those with your approved plan. And lastly, I will leave this up for my contact information as well as Aaron's. I'm sorry, I think I went a little over time. I don't have sort of a queue. I know usually there are people who sort of put their hands up or something when it's time to go, when time is almost up, but I couldn't see it, so I apologize. Do we have time for any questions?
We are over the time. There are some questions in the chat. Those who are still here could listen to the responses. I will ask that we close out by 4 p.m. Eastern at the latest. So
Okay,
if you
great.
would like, there's a few questions here. We have a question in the notice of award, page 3. It states if an initial payment is not requested within 30 business days of the project start date, contact your federal project officer to provide a reason for the inactivity. For this purpose, the person is asking the project start date. And we have people from various start dates on the call. So if you could just let folks know where they're supposed to find the start date, that would be lovely. Believe it's on the notice of award.
Yeah, it's on a notice of award. And I do want to point out that there's document like you're gonna meet with I know you're gonna meet with your program officer to there's gonna be a planning meeting that will take care of that basically. So you will have a planning meeting and that will be documented on basically to go over your project plan and your sort of drawdowns as well. So that will cover it, I would say. Your program meeting that you will have will cover it.
Okay, and then there's a few questions asking, do they in fact need to submit the FFR by October 30th? A little bit of a confusion going on.
All right, to clarify, I had mentioned there are two separate reports. There's a federal financial report, which is the FFR, and that's annual. And there's a federal cash transaction report, which is quarterly, and that you do have to submit the federal cash transaction report by October 30th. The federal cash transaction report, it consists of, let me go back to, those are the three items that you're gonna need to report on. The first one, 10A, is auto-populated. So basically, you're really reporting your disbursements. And the cash on hand will be, that's an auto calculation. So out of the three fields, the disbursement is the one that you're gonna have to enter.
Great.
I can see, let's see here. I can see some of the question. Let's see. Guidelines, federal guidelines and allowability. What's the, oh, I'm sorry, that was a question to the, that was a response to one of the questions I had asked. Already populated. The FFR form is already populated. Basis of accounting will not allow change from cash to accrual. So do you have a question on basically is the method of, if the method of accounting you think is not right, then you can contact your PMS liaison for that, and they can help you with that. If I understand that question correctly, or if you can unmute yourself, and I'm happy to answer that.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the folks who put these questions in are still here. We're having a lot of drop off. So I think that the best option would be, I will send you the remaining questions so that you can respond, and then I can send it out to the group.
Awesome.
Because we're having some folks dropping off the call. I want to thank you, Richard, for this presentation, and thank all our participants for joining us. And we, as your TA liaison, your ACL project officer, will be with you soon. Erin, would you like to say anything in closing?
Just want to thank you guys for your patience and for sitting through all of this. It's a lot to absorb in a one sitting. So know that if anything comes up, that we'll address any of your questions as we work with you individually on your projects. But thanks for all your time today.
All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Take care.